Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Pushkin House book talk. Hope everyone can hear me, which is a presentation of the book, The Compatriots, The Brutal and Chaotic History of Russia's Exiles, Emigres and Agents Abroad by its authors Irina, Borogan and Andrei Soldatov. My name is Rebecca Ostrovsky and I'm the Director of Communications at Pushkin House. Before we start, I'll just go over the usual housekeeping points, if you bear with me. First of all, as I'm sure you all know, please ensure that you are muted. This evening's talk will be recorded, so please also turn off your cameras if you don't wish to appear on the recording in any way. We will be actually sending out the recording to everybody tomorrow, and it'll be available for 72 hours for you to watch at your leisure on replay. And please do put any comments and questions in the chat, either after Irina and Andrei have finished speaking or as you go along. And then my colleague Rafy and I will help field the questions to Andrei and Irina. A final housekeeping point is to let you know that The Compatriots is available to purchase in the Pushkin House bookshop. And please, we'd love it if you chose to buy it from us rather than Amazon and all the big giants, because proceeds from our book sales go straight into our charitable activities. So to introduce Andrei and Irina, they are both renowned investigative journalists and they've worked together for many, many years. They are co-founders of the Agentura.ru website, which is a watchdog of the Russian Secret Service's activities. The Compatriots is the third book that they've co-authored, the others being The New Nobility, which was published in 2010, and The Red Web, which was published in 2015. And we are very lucky to have them here in London at the moment for the next 12 months or so, because they're visiting fellows at the Russia Institute at King's College London. A little bit about the book before we start. The Compatriots examines the shifting role of Russian expatriates throughout history and their complicated, unbreakable relationship with the mother country, be it antagonistic or far too chummy. The history of Russian espionage is soaked in blood, from a spontaneous pistol shot that killed a secret policeman in Romania in 1924 to the attempt to poison an exiled KGB colonel in Salisbury here in the UK in 2017. Russian emigres have found themselves continually at the centre of the mayhem. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Irina and Andrei for the presentation. We will of course leave plenty of time for your questions. So once again, please put them in the chat at any point and we'll do our best to make sure that Irina and Andrei have time to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for having us here, and hello, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. It's a great opportunity for us to be at Pushkin House. First of all, some technical explanation. In the vocabulary of Soviet propaganda, there were always two words describing Russians abroad. Emigrant was almost synonymous with enemy, defector, anti-Soviet element, traitor, or renegade. But people loyal to the Soviet authorities, in contrast, were always described using another word, compatriot. And with that, I give the floor to Irina.
As Rebecca said, we are Russian investigative journalists. For more than 20 years, we've been focused on researching the ways in which the Kremlin controls the Russian people. We wrote two books, one on the Russian security services and another one about the Kremlin's wars on the internet. So it seemed like the next natural step to look at another serious challenge to the Kremlin, the Russians outside Russia's borders. But it was also a challenge to us. Too. Because no one from our family emigrated. The Russian diaspora is the third largest in the world, exceeded only by those from India and Mexico. China is fourth. And that didn't start recently. Russians fled the country extensively for more than 100 years. The Tsar's crazy politics toward Jews, the revolution, civil war, the World War II, and crazy anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union forced millions to emigrate. In the 1990s, the time we remember very well, the emigration was in the spotlight of the society because the borders got opened for the first time and people began moving in both directions. Most of them came out of the country, but some of the emigrants went back to Russia to capture the new economic opportunities. As it turned out, the 1990s was the only decade in Russia's history when the country didn't have political exiles. When Putin came to power 20 years ago, he immediately reintroduced political emigration. Already in 2000, he forced the first group of his political opponents to leave the country. Simultaneously, the Kremlin came to see Russian emigration as a tool for promoting its influence abroad. And the Kremlin created a concept of Ruski Mir, or Russian world, the worldwide community of Russian-speaking people whose identity is firmly connected to Russia's history, culture, and language. It is a community whose members are, by definition, closely tied to Russia. As a result, three things emerged over the last 20 years. Putin has been pushing his political opponents out of the country, sometimes literally putting them on the plane to take them out of Russia. That happened with Mikhail Khodorkovsky in 2013. And this August, Alexei Navalny, unconscious, was put on the plane to Germany after he had been poisoned in Russia, and it is very unclear whether he would be led back to Russia. Once out of Russia in the West, the exiles present a challenge to the Kremlin, and the Kremlin takes this challenge very seriously, using all means possible to deal with them, including intimidation, spying, and even poisoning. In our book, we tell a story of Vladimir Putin, a Russian opposition politician who these days lives in Washington, D.C. Vladimir Putin was poisoned twice when he visited Moscow. We spent 20 years writing about the Russian secret services, but we were mostly focused on the domestic agency, the FSB. For this book, we researched the Russian intelligence agency, the SVR. It always enjoyed a much better reputation among journalists than the FSB. We discovered that this reputation was actually the result of a very successful disinformation operation, and we described it in the book. In reality, Putin's spies are very much like the Soviet KGB of the 1980s, and the KGB was a direct descendant of the Stalin's secret services. Stalin's obsession with political emigration and exiles was a defining element for his spies. When Stalin expelled his biggest political rival, a famous revolutionary Leon Trotsky, he still tasked his agent abroad to trace Trotsky and kill him. Stalin's obsessions with Trotsky and his supporters was so great that he insisted to fight them even after Trotsky's assassination in August 1940 in Mexico. For instance, in January 1941, the Moscow Center sent a secret cable to the chief of its intelligence station in New York, urging him to intensify the struggle against Trotskyites. The World War II already started. France was invaded, and it was just 5 months before the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. As we describe in the book, this experience defined methods of Soviet spies even after Stalin's death and made a big lasting impact on the modern Russian intelligence.
The Russian emigration is a very large topic, and our book focuses on one particular thing, the tricky relationship between the Kremlin and the Russians abroad. And to understand that relationship, we need to talk first about fear. It sounds a bit ironic. The Kremlin lets his opponents out of the country, always claiming they are not important or pose no threat, and then gets obsessed with them. We have the oligarchs like Gusinsky, Berezovsky, or Khodorkovsky, the journalists like Vladimir Karamurza, the politicians and celebrities like Garry Kasparov. And we all know that we are not the most popular politicians in Russia, and yet the Kremlin finds them extremely dangerous. We tried to find a good explanation of that strange phenomenon, and what we found out was the Kremlin's fear of another revolution. The Kremlin believes that in 1917, the mighty Russian Empire, with probably the most powerful secret police in the world then, was taken down by a bunch of emigrant revolutionaries who, at the end of the First World War, seized the opportunity to return to the country. Many in the Russian secret services, including intelligence, we spoke to are strong believers in that theory. So why another group of exiles, as that theory goes, will not try the same thing if only given a chance? And of course, this approach ignores much of the history of the last part of the 19th century and of the first half of the 20th century. But it hardly matters for the people in Lubyanka and the Kremlin. Especially because these days, we already have the Russians in Washington and London and European capitals aspiring to have a say in defining these countries' politics towards Russia. And in some cases, for instance, with the sanctions, they are quite successful, which provoke more paranoia from the Kremlin. But this is a perception of the Kremlin. And now let's try to talk about the reality. The history of the Russian political emigration after the Bolshevik Revolution could be seen as a case study of what could be done and could not be done with the totalitarian regime like the Soviet Russia regime from abroad. Because the émigré groups tried almost everything over the last century. They started with a terror campaign, they sent agents undercover to bomb Bolsheviks in Russia, and they attacked Soviet officials when they traveled abroad. When the Soviet army got involved in a military conflict abroad, like in Spain during the Civil War in the 1930s, the Russian emigrants sent their soldiers to help Franco. When the Second World War started for Russia, some immigrants took the side of the Germans. During the Cold War, the emigrants participated in espionage and in a propaganda campaign. They sent balloons over the borders with leaflets, and of course, they joined the radio stations launched by the Americans, which targeted the Soviet people and people in Eastern Europe. The immigrants also staged manifestations and protest rallies in the West, trying to affect and impact the public opinion in the West, and even bombed an office of the Soviet trade company Amtorg in New York. Now, with all the years past, we can try to assess how successful they were. And it is clear that most of these efforts simply failed. What was also not very helpful, that the Russians abroad, especially politically active, were notoriously bad at building up political organizations, to much of despair of the Americans who invested in them. The Russians argued and intrigued constantly, and almost nothing worked. There was one thing where the Russians abroad were quite successful. The books they wrote and smuggled to the West were sometimes instrumental at changing public opinion on Russia in the West. Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Svetlana Alliluyeva, Stalin's daughter, are just a few examples. If nothing else, the books worked. The collapse of the Soviet Union changed the game completely because the borders got opened, as Irina said, and some of the Russians got back. But the Russian political émigré organizations failed to build a strong presence in the country. Some of them tried, but failed. The different kind of émigrés were much more successful. And this kind went back to Russia for new financial opportunities, not politics. And indeed, under Yeltsin, some of them made a lot of money in Russia. But when we got Putin, and when Putin came to power, he immediately grasped how to use them to his advantage. In our book, we tell stories how Russian Americans helped Putin to score some of his big political successes, both domestically and abroad. Domestically, the Russian Americans helped Putin, for instance, to secure control of the media, most famously of the NTV of Vladimir Putin. Internationally, the Russian Americans helped Putin to eliminate the idea of the so-called other Russia, spiritual Russia, uncorrupted by communism and independent from Moscow, the idea we had during the Cold War. The Russian Orthodox Church abroad, known as the White Church, in contrast to the Red Church we had in Moscow, embodied this idea of the other Russia during the Cold War. But Putin wanted one, united Russia. And in our book, we tell how the Russian Americans helped Putin subordinate the White Church to the Patriarch in Moscow. On the way, Putin secured support of many descendants of the first wave of emigration, including aristocracy, which is quite surprising given how their ancestors were prosecuted, hunted down by Chekists. And surprisingly, many of them have supported Putin in what he has been doing in the country and in his exploits abroad, including the annexation of Crimea. In the meantime, the Russians keep leaving the country, even now, for various reasons, some of them for political reasons, some for economic reasons, putting in the already huge community of the Russians almost everywhere. According to Putin and his statistics, this Russian world, or Ruski Mir, now consists of more than 30 million people, with 10 million living in Europe. And from the very beginning, right after the revolution of 1917, the Kremlin has seen the Russians abroad not only as a challenge, but also the opportunity. First of all, Moscow's spy masters scored the biggest successes, recruiting among the Western establishment, stealing the secrets of the American atomic bomb through networks of spies, many of whom were emigrants driven from Russia. And Russian intelligence remains obsessed by this legacy. In our book, we tell a story of a family of two Stalin's most successful spies, Naum Etingon and Vasily Zarubin, tracing it from Lenin to the present day. And one of them, Naum Etingon, organized the assassination of Trotsky. The other, Vasily Zarubin, was the chief of the spy station in New York during the war. And even now, his portrait is proudly displayed in the office of Sergei Naryshkin, the present chief of the SVR. So it's not really that surprising that under Putin, a former KGB officer himself, Russia has been investing significant resources in building the Compatriots organizations all over the world. Sometimes we think how you can control these people if the borders remain porous and you can travel wherever you want. It's a very interesting question for us because on the surface, it should be even technically difficult. But when we researched the book and spoke to many prominent immigrants from the oligarchs to people in the church, almost every one of them asked us at some moment a question about Skripals. So in the West, the operation of poisoning, unsuccessful poisoning of the Skripals might be seen as a big disaster and failure for Russian intelligence. But for the Russians and for the Russians abroad, it has a completely different meaning. It means that actually that the regime in Moscow can do whatever we want, and we are not limited by their actions and by methods if we want to reach here. And this message is actually a very strong message, especially if you have such a recent totalitarian past in your country. Thank you, and we will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so I'll start by asking one of my own, which is that Mikhail Khodorkovsky spoke at Chatham House this week on various subjects. I mean, he was talking mostly about what the real national interests of Russia are and how to best politically reform the country to achieve them. But he mentioned something which is quite interesting. His argument was that about 20 million of the Russian population, so about 15% or a little bit less, are politically active, and these are the people who are really involved in politics and who can have any kind of impact on politics, either because they choose to be active or because they happen to be working in certain fields or located in certain areas that makes them more politically impactful. Do you think that the compatriots and the emigres are more or less politically active than that? And in general, which sort of direction do you see them being leaning? I suppose Khodorkovsky, for example, is obviously an opponent of the regime, but many of the Russian residents here and in Europe won't be. So could you say a little bit about that?
Well, I think that the percentage of political active people among Russians abroad might be a bit higher because they have this big problem of national identity. And I think it partly explains why so many of the descendants of the first wave of Russian immigrants decided to support Putin. Because, well, logically, it doesn't sound really, you can't explain it by using logic. And what struck us when we spoke to these people, that it looks like they share the same ideas Putin shares about the glorious imperial past of Russia. It looks like they just exported with them, brought with them these ideas of Russia of the 19th century. Maybe because inside Russia, we always have these debates, which might be really hot, is about the date when everything went wrong. So some could argue that, look, it happened in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. More liberal people would say, no, it's about 1917, and probably the last moment that Russia had a chance was the revolution in February of 1917. Some other people might say, no, it's all about 1905 and the war with Japan, when the imperial regime went really repressive, and the first Russian Revolution started. And after that, everything went wrong. So we are, to some extent, we're always thinking about our past. And for some people who left Russia back in the beginning of the 20th century, it looks like the best time was nevertheless the 19th century. And back then, it was Imperial Russia, of course. Putin understands that really clearly, and he knows how to play with his feelings. We have this famous saying of one of the Russian Tsars that Russia has only two allies, the Russian Navy and the Russian Army. And it has some appeal to lots of people in Russia and to lots of people outside Russia. And Putin himself opened the monument to this Tsar in Crimea, of all of the places, some years ago, with these very words inscribed on the monument. So he understands how to talk to these people, how to appeal to them. So I think the problem here that if you have this burning question of your national identity, it makes you a bit more politically active. The other problem is that people who are in, I would say, the present leaders of the political organizations of emigres who emigrated recently, like Garry Kasparov or Mikhail Khodorkovsky or some other people, they sort of, I would say, they do not believe that Russians abroad could be a real source of change in the country. I remember when I spoke to Khodorkovsky about this very problem, he said, and it was very, I would say, very sad to hear him saying that that Russia is such a big country and that nothing could be done from outside. It's just impossible. And Garry Kasparov in New York told us that, look, you want us what? To work with all these people on Brighton Beach? There is no sense to talk to them. So we have here the big void of Russian liberal politicians working with Russians abroad, and this void, to some extent, filled by the Kremlin, because they launched a lot of organizations, Россотрудничество, all kinds of foundations, not to mention the media, and again they are filling the void, and they know how to talk to these people, and that makes the situation quite complicated, I would say.
Yeah, and while researching the book, we met a lot of people in the United States, immigrants, who emigrated in the 70s and in the 80s last century, and they still have a lot of nostalgic feelings to the Soviet Union, surprisingly, and to the modern Russia. And many of them, it's just normal average people, and many of them, like Vladimir Putin, not like real politician, like real president of Russia, but they like them as a personality, as a symbol of strong new Russia, and they supported him. And for me, it was surprising that many of them, people, a Jewish immigration, people who immigrated from the Soviet Union because anti-Semitism, and given the fact that Putin came from the KGB and they know this, they supported his international politics, and they supported annexation of Crimea. Annexation of Crimea is, pivotal point for the Russian immigration in the United States and here in the United Kingdom. So it gives Putin a huge opportunity to recruit these people to some extent, not like a real agent, not like a people who will be spying for him, but like people who supported Russian initiatives abroad, and some Russian international initiatives. And you can see many people who supported pro-Kremlin political actions in London and in New York. And they participated in pro-Kremlin manifestations, and they visited Russian Cultural Center, and they visited Russian embassy for many events. So it's immigration. This is a base for recruitment. This is like Vladimir Putin look at immigration.
Thank you. So we've got a question here from Luke Harding. What role do Russian expats in London play in Kremlin thinking? Boris Johnson has just made Evgeny Lebedev appear, Lord Lebedev of Hampton in Siberia. Is it fair to see Lebedev and other high-profile Russians in the UK as part of the Kremlin influence operation? Thanks.
Firstly, for Russian year, it sounds very, very funny. His title Siberian.
Yeah, because as far as I remember, he first requested from the Russian government the title connected with Moscow, but apparently he was not given this title, and instead he was given the title of Siberia, which for the Russians sounds a bit as a hint that, look, guys, you might be very successful in London, but we have this special place, Siberia, and this place has a very special meaning for lots of Russians, meaning that you can be...
It's a place for gulag.
Yeah, it's a place for prison camps. So if you do something wrong, you can, find yourself in this place. And I think the Kremlin, and Putin personally, he is extremely smart and skillful at playing this game. I remember talking to Alexander Lebedev, Yevgeny's father, for the book. And on the surface, he looked very relaxed. And we had this conversation in Moscow on Rublyovka, and his very luxury mansion in the woods of Rublyovka. But when you speak to him and ask some questions, it's immediately clear that he is, to some extent, he is very edgy and very nervous about what's going on in Moscow. For instance, I asked him about Vladimir Karamurza Jr. poisonings, because Vladimir Karamurza was poisoned twice, in 2015 and 2017. And his father, Vladimir Karamurza Sr., was a personal friend of Alexander Lebedev. So you cannot deny your knowledge about of this situation because you're too close. So I asked him, what do you think? And he went into such a strange denial. He denied almost everything. He denied the fact of poisoning. He denied the fact that we have a proper opposition movement in Russia. He denied that Russian intelligence or any government organization could use poison or any kind of methods to attack the opposition because the opposition doesn't exist. So, when you hear this kind of denials, you understand that this guy is actually very nervous. And finally, that sort of opened him up for me. And he said something really sad. He said that he tried many times during his long career, political career in Russia, because he had a political career in Russia. For instance, he tried to participate in the elections in Moscow for the position of the Moscow mayor. And he tried to launch his own party. He supported some newspapers in Moscow and still supports, critical of the Kremlin. But because he did one mistake, and this mistake was to launch a newspaper which reported about Putin's divorce, and that sort of destroyed his business in Russia completely, and he lost lots of assets. He lost his bank. He lost his assets, and he was told to do some, like he can launch some private business, very small level businesses, and that's it. And that was quite clear that even if this guy is not completely under control, or if, say, at some moment he believed in himself as an independent figure, the Kremlin always have some means to send you a message that we still can have you on a very short leash, and we can do whatever we want with you, with your assets, with your family, and just remember that. And we can talk to, and we can approach you if you want to.
Okay, a couple of linked questions here from Helen Harris and Rupert Borden. Could you possibly say something about the almost 1 million Russians who emigrated to Israel in the 1990s? And how would you define that community today? And what are their links to Russia?
We did write about Israeli emigration in our book, but of course we have some knowledge about this because Israel and Russia, they are very close, and most of people immigrated to, I don't know, not most, but a lot of immigrated to Israel in the early 90s. And it was like a huge topic for discussions, and it's, I don't know, everybody knows that, and everybody knows somebody who immigrated. And this community is a little bit strange to us. I mean that these people were very liberal and anti-Soviet when they immigrated. But now it seems that most of them are quite right-wing and supported things that they didn't support in Russia. I mean, annexation, a lot of strange legislation against non-government organizations who don't support the government policy, and so on and so far. So for me, I don't know, I was unpleasantly surprised when all this fact, when I knew all these facts, and anytime, this topic is very difficult to discuss in Russia because the emotions are too high about this topic. But if you can't say, you have to talk about this very cautiously. And then even now, talking about it, I try to be very cautious and not to offend any feelings. But these people became much more anti-liberal and much more right-wing when they immigrated. It's a pity to me.
But at the same time, I would say that there is still some hope, and some very unexpected hope, I would say. When we traveled to to the West Bank some years ago, doing some reporting, and we traveled with Palestinians who studied in Voronezh, and that's why they spoke Russian well fluently. And it was very hot in the middle of the summer, and horrible roads, and we were waiting in some very long line before the checkpoint established by Israeli forces, and the emotions went really high. People were swearing all the time, and we just were feeling that actually it's getting really dangerous for everybody, especially when we saw that the checkpoint consisted only one Humvee and 3 unfortunate soldiers. And just imagine how many people around them hated them for being an obstacle and for stopping them and forcing them to wait in this very long line. And finally, we approached this Humvee, and the emotions were really, really high until the moment we say something in Russian. And all of a sudden, we understood that actually all people around us are speaking Russian. We have Palestinians on our side, and they speak Russian. And 2 soldiers from Humvee, they also speak Russian because they immigrated recently from Russia. And somehow, I don't know, miraculously, it completely eased all the tensions. And I think it's not right now, we don't have this option in Israeli politics, and nobody ever tried to use it. But I think there is some hope there.
Very useful for Russian House to promote Russian language in Israel.
Yeah.
And do those Russians who have immigrated to Israel have the same kind of government links and pressure that maybe the ones in London have, or is it a little bit more kind of laissez-faire from the Russian Kremlin side?
It's a bit different because we don't have the reason why we spent much of the time and much of the space in the book describing the situation in New York, because most of the political organizations of immigration, they were based there and still based there. And it started even before the war. If you look at where the church is based, it's New York. If you look at where the white immigration organizations are based, again, it's New York. If you look at where the third wave, third generation political organizations were based, again, it's New York and partly London. In Israel, we have some people, but it's about personalities. It's not about organizations. Though there was one line used by the Kremlin in Israel, and it started with not with Benjamin Netanyahu, but a bit earlier. In the early 2000s, the Kremlin and Israel, they found a common ground in what they understand as a fighting against terrorism. For instance, and it was striking for me that we all know that Soviet and Russian intelligence has a very, I would say, long history of political assassinations abroad. Nevertheless, in the early 2000s, the Russian intelligence got obsessed, I would say, by Israeli experience. And the very first liquidation we got in the modern history abroad, it was in 2004 in Qatar, when the vice president of the independent Ichkeria, Chechnya, Zelimkhan Yandarbiyev, was bombed. And people who did that, back then we were able to speak to them, and they told us that they were inspired by Israeli Mossad experience. So there were these connections between them. The Israelis also, they tried to exploit this idea, but we can help you with some ideas how to fight terrorism in your country, because we do the same thing. We are fighting international jihadism. And of course, it was a very oversimplified picture of what 2 countries faced. But in terms of propaganda and public diplomacy, it was good for both countries. I would say that it's ended for the population in Israel in 2006, during the war between Israel and Lebanon. Back then, some recent emigres from Russia, with some military experience in Chechnya in the 1990s, they applied to the government, the Israeli government, saying they want to form a battalion of Chechen veterans, meaning veterans of the war in Chechnya. And, and the government say, okay, fine. But the very first thing these people started doing, they started purging the villages of Palestinians and Lebanese, and in such a horrible manner that this battalion was almost immediately disbanded because it was such a big embarrassment for Israeli army. So I would say right now, nobody believes that this kind of sharing of experience could actually be productive for these two countries.
I'll just read a comment here from Sarah Diligenti, which is that exactly the same thing happened to her when she visited Israel and Palestinian territories as to you, that she spoke Russian all the time, more English and hardly any Hebrew. And the young women at the airport checking luggage on the way back also spoke Russian to each other there. And there's a really interesting question here from Michael Kellett, which is, does the Russian government exercise any influence over Russian-speaking émigrés from other countries of the former Soviet Union? And I assume here that it means, for example, people who left, for example, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so have a kind of ties theoretically to the Kremlin, possibly after 1991 as well. But is there any kind of link there between the Kremlin and these émigrés?
Yeah, of course, because the Kremlin always could play one very good card, and this card is the legacy of the Second World War. Because back then it was one Soviet Union, and parents and grandparents served in the same army, shared the same experience. At the same, it's a very important feeling for many people in the former Soviet Union, and no matter they still live in, say, Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, or they left these countries and now they live in New York. They're very proud of what their parents did during the war, and this feeling of pride was exploited by the Kremlin when the Kremlin launched an initiative called the Immortal Regiment. It means that on May the 9th, when we have officially the Victory Day, all over the world, it started with Moscow, but now we have like 12 cities in the United States alone. When you have people marching the streets with portraits of the relatives who took part in the war. And
Descendants.
yeah, this kind of thing. But they have these portraits, and we saw these people by ourselves in New York, and you can see that in London, in Israel, of course. And it's a very big thing because this legacy of the Second World War is actually the only ideology which still unites all people who used to live in the Soviet Union. And it's a very powerful idea. It's extremely powerful idea because it's addressed so many issues. It's addressed the issue about why Russia and the Soviet Union was so special, because we saved the world, blah, 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 from Germans. Why we should be, why, and we have these feelings of grievance against the West, because they are ungrateful to us, because they saved them. And all these small things might be exploited and are exploited very skillfully with people who once lived in the Soviet Union. And I would say that it's not even about the Soviet Union alone. You can see the same feeling among people from Poland, sometimes in the Czech Republic, and of course in the Baltic countries. So it's a wide sharing feeling, and yeah, it's a very powerful thing.
Yeah, in fact, when I went to Russia, I was quite surprised to hear from older Russians that the kind of Besmertny Polk thing is new, and it's not ever been done in the Soviet Union at all, because it seems
it started in 2015.
Yeah, because it seems like such a kind of established tradition, and also something that could conceivably have been done for quite a long time, but actually it's far more kind of individual than they would ever have allowed in the USSR. So it's a kind of very modern cultural thing. So here we have a question from Sarah Wilson, who thank you for joining us, Sarah. She's given a talk here a while ago, in fact in person it was. Where do you situate the major field of cultural exchanges in terms of protest and liberty? And for example, the Royal Academy Russian show, are these transcending contemporary politics, or are they meaningless cosmetics? And in fact, I would also add in another question, which is from John Allen, which is that, is this kind of soft power political policy of art as well, to show Russian art in other countries?
Take the first.
Okay, I think that, of course, we can say that, oh, well, given the horrible history of Soviet Russian intelligence and that culture centers were always exploited by Soviet spies, and we have a lot of examples in our book about that, and it's still the case. The last time the chief of the Russian Culture Center was exposed as a spy was actually a few years ago in Washington. So on the surface, it looks very ominous, but I think that still there is some sense, something good in it, because this is the only way for many Russian writers to actually to meet the Western audience. And sometimes it's really good. For instance, we had a friend of ours. He is a really good writer, but for some reason he got this idea that if he went to some fellowship to the West, he would be immediately approached by CIA or MI6, I don't know who else, and recruited. And when he did go to a fellowship, well, nothing actually happened to him. I mean, nobody approached him, and he was so surprised. And now he's, well, that changed a lot for him. And it's not the only example. We can think that, look, it might be the case, it could be the case before 1991, when the country was closed, but it's still the case, because we still have cultural borders. So if we can bring some people, or you can bring some people out of Russia to the West, and to start this dialogue, and to have this dialogue alive, it's still a very good thing. Well, that's my opinion. What do you think?
I think I want to tell a few words about soft power.
Yeah, sure.
And the Kremlin. Of course, when Kremlin started establish all these hundreds of Россотрудничества offices and cultural, and expand its cultural centers in literally every country. Of course, the Kremlin tried to copy the British and American policy in terms of soft power. And because they were obsessed in the 90s, the Kremlin was obsessed with such a thing like British consul in Moscow and a lot of an uncountable amount of American initiatives established in Russia. So they always wanted to copy this, but until the early 2000s, they just physically didn't have money for this. And when they start in the early 2000s, they started in the early 2000s, and they couldn't, and they can't stop so far. But not all of these attempts and not all of these initiatives are malicious or poisonous, and not all of people who works for Россотрудничество are spies or using for recruiting agents abroad. Most of these initiatives, they are really cultural initiatives and don't have any kind of poisonous goals. But at the same time, of course, every time when the Kremlin use its cultural centers and Россотрудничество, they try to put all events and all initiatives in a special context, pro-Kremlin context, pro-Russia context, and to gain to gain some support from Russian emigration abroad, and also from other people, if it's possible. So that's, of course, most of these initiatives, that's soft power, and they cooperate with the West.
Yeah, and I think probably the main difference really between whether art is going to be sort of independent or pro-Kremlin is just the choice of institution that is putting something on. I mean, if it's backed by the Kremlin or by Russian state money, then it's likely to be either probably not explicitly pro-Kremlin, but it's going to be only allowed because it's not threatening to them. And Sarah Wilson mentions also the critical America-based work of gay Jewish artist Evgeny Fix, who had a show at Pushkin House, I think it was last year. And I think that probably says something to the value of non-profit independent cultural centers like Pushkin House and counterparts in America, although there are fewer in America, they're mostly to do with politics in America, I found. But there is certainly Russian émigrés doing lots of really interesting and completely independent and critical work in the art fields. So it's not just that, I mean, obviously the Russian state has a strong influence, and they promote what they want to promote, but I think we should also mention that there are a lot of other works by émigrés that are becoming much more culturally important to the West, just in their own right.
Absolutely right.
Right.
There's a comment from Theo B here, which is that he detects a deep desire for purity and honesty in the way that you would like post-communist Russia to be. But is the reality not that the kind of underhand fighting you talk about is all pervasive in the West as well as in Russia, where the West is just a bit more sophisticated in the way it covers these things up? And this kind of reminds me of how there was this huge idea of Russian collusion in the elections. Would you like to say something about that and the way that émigrés fit into that?
Well, you know that our previous book, The Red Web, was about cyber operations, and we published the book in 2015, and just before the Russian interference and the election. And when it happened, our publisher immediately contacted us and said, "Look, could you add a chapter about the interference for the paperback edition?" And we did. So we researched and investigated the Russian cyber operation. So when we researched for the this new book, we tried to understand how Russian offline compatriots organizations in the US, what did they do? What was the role for these organizations? Because you have offline and online elements, which means they should be somehow engaged, activated in this operation. If it was such a big thing for the Kremlin, as it apparently was, given the reaction in Moscow, jubilation actually when Trump was elected. But to our surprise, we found out that these compatriots organizations in the US were never activated, which was a big surprise for us. And the only theory we developed why it never happened is that probably, if you remember the timeline of when the Russian cyber operations was exposed, it was very early, before the election, already in June. And we believe that probably because it was exposed so early, cyber element of the attack, the Kremlin decided not to activate the offline element because it would be a disaster. They would just compromise everything and everybody. And given Putin's personal KGB background, for him, these people, people who are physically in the United States, they are of course much more precious and expensive and much more important than any Soviet operations, which are relatively low-cost operations. So probably he just decided to save them and not to activate because it was such a big scandal. So yeah, that's basically what we have.
But Russian immigrants were somehow involved in 2016 cyber attacks on DNC and American elections. But on the other side, the company which investigated and found out intruders and who were these hackers, this cybersecurity company was founded by a Russian immigrant who left the country in the 90s. His name is Dmitry Alperovich, and he's fascinating guy. And he was the first who gave the false information about Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. I mean that they attacked the American elections and DNC in 2016. So Russian immigrants, they're everywhere, from the one side and from another
from
side.
both sides. Yeah.
From both sides.
That actually kind of links into a question I actually missed a little earlier, which is that Lucy Ash says, does this sort of actual political activism, Soviet-inspired communism in the USA, for example, does it mean that Senator McCarthy wasn't in fact completely wrong to allege these things?
Well, I think he was completely wrong when he attacked athletes and culture figures. That was just insane. What it was, a witch hunt. But what we know now, thanks to the work of some historians, for instance, I think I can address you to Richard Aldrich's book, Hidden Hand, and some other works about the Cold War intelligence, that back then the American intelligence already knew a lot about Russian operations, Soviet operations, thanks to so-called Venona files. So lots of Russian cables were already intercepted and deciphered. The problem was that this information wasn't possible to use, in public. So probably, McCarthy heard something about that. So probably he sort of understood what was going on, but instead of just leave it to the counterintelligence to do a proper counterintelligence work, he was just obsessed with his own popularity, and he wanted to make a name out of his mess. But yes, what we found out when we researched this book about the Russian operations in New York during the war, well, that's something. Because to be honest, we never, we did think that actually such a big success as the stealing of atomic bomb was actually organized through the networks of the Russian immigrants, and that the same networks were also used to keep an eye on Trotsky, and that it was such a big network launched by one guy, Yakov Golos, and he was a fascinating character. He recruited so many people, and the most striking thing about him, just imagine this guy, he attacked the white emigre organizations for years. And when the war started, and the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, and the same guy who spied on white emigre organizations approached them saying, look, I have my son sent back to Russia to fight the Germans. So now we need to forget about the ideology. And all of us, because we are Russians, we need to go back to Russia and fight and help Russia. If you cannot go to Russia, you need to stay here in the United States and help our common cause. It was such a cynicism to some extent, because this guy, he never forgot about ideology, of course, but he was able to recruit lots of people from white immigrant organizations, and these people did send their sons to Russia, and that made them hostages. And these people were subsequently recruited by Soviet intelligence to spy on Americans.
Yeah, it's quite a brilliant sort of master stroke of spycraft there, and I think probably one of the Americans, well, to my mind, their kind of expectation that the Russians are kind of meddling in their politics probably comes from, well, first is the kind of, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg American spy rings that did really exist and were managed by the KGB, but also probably an idea that they, with the CIA, have been doing quite similar things all over the country, all over the world, and it would be surprising if Russia wasn't doing something similar. There is a question here from Matthew Salomon, who says, congratulations on the book, which was so well written, he was compelled to read it in a sitting.
Oh,
put it down.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And this is probably, he says, maybe not a question, but something regarding the Russian world, Ruski mir concept, which seems to be related to something quite a lot older and more evident in 19th century literature, which is that the idea Russia has something to prove to the West. For example, Chichikov's great Troika line at the end of Gogol's Dead Souls. Do you see the modern Russian world imperative as related to kind of older ideas that existed in feudal Russia?
Yes, of
Absolutely.
course, because absolutely. And it seems that in the 90s, we were connected to the Russian tradition much less than now. I mean that I couldn't remember that people very often referred to the 19th century tradition. We wanted to be like the West, like the Western countries, democratic, liberal, and progressive. But when Putin came to power, he started to refer to the 19th century, to the Russian aristocracy, and the KGB, the chief of the FSB, Patrushev, called the FSB the new nobility. That means, it sounds strange because these people, they are ancestors of the descendants of KGB and Cheka, which was the huge enemies of Russian aristocracy. But Patrushev called the FSB people the new nobility, which means that that Patrushev and Putin wanted to resurrect, to some extent, ideologically or somehow, the old traditional thinking of 19th centuries. And all the things included about Russian Empire, including annexation of Crimea, is also closely connected with the 19th century. And of course, the USSR, but mostly with the 19th century, because during the USSR, Crimea was Ukrainian. So Putin is quite old-fashioned, but he is such old-fashioned as it fits to the ideology of many Russians right now. So he felt that Russians need something more stable and more known than Western tradition, that Yeltsin tried to promote. And he felt this, and he used all these old ideals and all these old symbols, and just he wrapped it in a new bright, colorful paper.
And I would add that, of course, it's not only about Putin. We have had this in our society for decades, maybe centuries, this demand for explanation why Russia is so unique. And it's a very big feeling, because if you say that Russia is unique, it means that you cannot be comparable to, and that we present a unique civilization in contrast to Western civilization. It's a very flattering thing, because in this case, you are equal not to, say, the United Kingdom or France or the United States. You are equal to the whole West, which means that you're such a big country with such a big ideology, and that gives you some feeling of self-importance and of belonging to something really, really big. And Russian tsars and Russian emperors, they started exploiting this feeling back in the 18th century, I think, even before. I think I was the third, actually, started with this with this idea that we are true successors to the Byzantine Empire, and we know how to do these things properly, and we are the third Rome, all that. So yes, of course, it's especially when you do not have a real ideology. The problem is that the only ideology we had since the 1960s was not communism. Nobody believed in communism. I mean, my parents, my grandparents, nobody, it was such a strange idea, but everybody believed in the idea of the Second World War, the common suffering, that lots of people suffered and that there should be some meaning to that. And that united everybody. But apart from that, you need something else. You cannot talk all the time about the war. Well, we have this now, unfortunately, in the country. We have the country obsessed with the Second World War, which is probably not that unique. Look at Poland.
Well, or even Britain, to be honest. But I think there's a very interesting point here, which is that the idea of suffering has to mean something. It's quite a sort of strongly Christian idea that through suffering you will reach a kind of redemption. And I wanted to ask a little bit about Putin's use of, again, another sort of pre-revolutionary Tsarist idea, which is the strong Russian Orthodox Church. He's been, putting up these enormous churches and the statue to Vladimir, who brought Christianity to the Rus. Is there a kind of any strength in the idea that the Russian Orthodox Church is also a focal point for émigrés, through which loyalty to the Kremlin can be drawn out?
Yes, to some extent it's true. The problem is that the Russian Orthodox Church is actually quite unique and very different from, say, Catholicism, because, well, Vatican is global. It cannot be nationalized. It's not about one country. In Russia, first of all, it's about one country. And for centuries, not the patriarch, but the Tsar was the head of the church. And actually, patriarch became independent only under Stalin, surprisingly. Before that, it was all up to the Tsars and to the emperor to decide everything about the church, which made the church not just part of the state, but it's exploited one thing about the church, which was very important, is the idea that Russia is always on defensive, attacked from many angles, many sides. And we have this idea, and it's to some extent it's in our blood, that we are attacked all the time. We are attacked by Mongols from the east, or we are attacked by Germans from the west, or we are attacked by French, and it happens all the time. And the reason for that is because we have this unique spirituality provided by the Russian Orthodox Church. And given the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church is so incorporated in the Russian state, it played a very bad job with the Russian Orthodox Church in the late Soviet years. We had back then, especially in the 70s, some independent-minded priests, but these people were attacked by the church because the church wanted to be part of the state no matter what. So when Soviet authorities started abandoning quietly some, say, atheism ideas, and they, for instance, I remember that very vividly in my childhood, then it was possible to go to church and to celebrate Easter. Immediately, the church became very, very pro-government, and they attacked independent priests. So this idea that the church should somehow help the government, and the government should help the church, is very important. And we had some cases. We described that, for instance, in our first book, when the church got scared by Catholics in Russia. And we asked the FSB to expel several priests, Catholic priests from Russia. And the FSB did that. They just helped the church to protect their territory from proselytizing Catholics. And of course, now when you have Russian presence in other countries, these two forces, these two powers, they are, in many cases, they are working together. We started the book with the description of the Russian spiritual cultural center in Paris. And it's a very interesting example because in one thing you have the Russian cultural center, the cathedral, and this facility is owned and funded by the administration of the president of the Russian Federation, despite the fact that it also has a cathedral and it's run by a priest, who is, by the way, a former official of the Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry. And when we asked it, what does it mean? They said, look, it presents a perfect symphony of two powers. And that's exactly how the church now sees this cooperation.
And also the reason why the Russian Orthodox Church so close to the state, because state provides money. Even Yeltsin, he allowed, back in the 1990s, he allowed the Russian Orthodox Church to sell vodka and tobacco without taxes, and it was a huge source of money for the Russian Orthodox Church. And they sold tobacco and vodka, and they enriched themselves. And also, when Putin tried to unite the Red Church with the White Church, his people also use this argument, and it was very important for the poor, quite poor Russian Orthodox Church abroad. That states provides money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that explains quite a lot about the dynamic that we see with the Russian Orthodox Church, that it is relying on this. I didn't know, in fact, how close the state and church were in the Soviet period. I'd obviously known about it during the Tsarist period, but it's interesting to hear about how even in the late Soviet period there was cooperation, and that kind of explains quite a lot about how we see things like the taboo over the Solovki Gulag we have today, that now they're very against ever saying that it was even a gulag, and it explains slightly the recent, it's not that recent actually, the banning of the Jehovah's Witnesses as a recruiting church in Russia that could theoretically destabilize the role of the Russian Orthodox Church. So that's a fascinating kind of insight into the network that makes up the Russian Vlast. We have a question here from Sarah again, which is that it's Russian uniqueness versus American exceptionalism, or Russian uniqueness versus Western liberalism. And there's a question whether the West can really still be grouped together in the same way that it was maybe 10 years ago, that even in the West, liberalism probably has retreated by quite a fair bit. I mean, we see recently, I think it was that a couple of quite scary things have come out about the UK government, which is that I mean, I had no part in it, but obviously the Windrush scandal has shown that the civil servants and government ministers had been basically not doing their jobs on keeping legal immigrants to Britain within their sort of legal rights to stay here, and also that the Whitehall has just been found to have been running a secret operation to vet any information that was coming out, which I assumed they had already done before, but apparently is not allowed. And I'm sure I've got some of the details wrong about that, but that I think there's a fair question to say that what exactly Russia is defining itself against now. Is it what they call like Evropa, or is it something more of a kind of nebulous idea of Europe that doesn't quite correspond to the real contradictions that we see in the West today?
I I think
It's complicated because it's two parts of this. On the one side, Russians now are really very anti-Western, and they're really anti-European and exceptionally anti-American. But on the other side, if you try to compare Russians with Chinese, they will be very offended. They will be offended very much. So you can do this. So it shows us that Russians don't want to be like Eastern people. They don't look like Chinese or Asian people. But at the same time, they demonstrate that they are anti-European. I think, to me, it's now just a short period when Russians felt offended and a little bit offended by the Europe and by the Americans, that they refused to recognize Russia the same great as the United States and Europe. So I hope that it will end very soon, because when you talk to very anti-American and anti-European Russians, you can notice very fast that they wanted to be like, they love European and American movies. They love European and American music, and their style and their way of behavior in average life are more close to Europeans and to Americans, and they know nothing about Chinese people. They know nothing about Asian people.
I think, yeah, I agree. I think it's a hate-love relationship with Europe specifically, but we are not allowed into this European family, and we feel a bit offended by that. And how desperate lots of Russians, especially people in big cities, want to be part of Europe now is very evident. If you go to Moscow, especially now in November, you can see that lots of people, they just refuse to accept that we have the winter. They try to say, no, we have something similar to European weather. So they try not to wear really warm clothes. They're trying to ignore it completely. And in Moscow specifically, it's a very funny thing. The other thing, if you look at some books written recently by Russian authors, sometimes it's really striking that these people, they try to defend Europe from Europe. I think the most famous example in Russia was a book published maybe 10 years ago, which was with the title The Mosque of Notre Dame, written by Chudinova. It's a very strange novel. The idea is that France and Paris specifically are occupied by Muslims, and all Catholics, they live in underground, and they start with underground resistance movement and all that. And you understand that lots of Russian writers and intelligentsia, they're obsessed with the idea of Europe of, say, 19th century. So we would love to see Europe, and that's why we have all this talk about traditional values. Well, I would love to see Paris like it was maybe in movies, like 200 years ago, in the time of Dumas and Hugo, and maybe even before the French Revolution. And that betrays several things. First of all, that there is no real connection between Russia and Europe, and lots of Russians, they don't know what's going on in Europe. They are not very versed in present political and social reality of European countries. So that's actually, it gets us back to the question whether we need these cultural exchanges. Of course we do, because we need to, again, to explain people what is going on in Europe. And at the same time, it betrays that this feeling that there is somewhere, I would say, some traditional ideal Europe, which we can be part of, but we are not allowed. And of course, it's a very strong feeling, and that's why so many people get really emotional about this issue.
Andrei, I want to remind you that some people in Europe also wanted old traditional Europe, because after this book by Russian author Elena Chudinova was published, many years passed, and Michel Houellebecq wrote his book Submission, which it's not the same, but the idea behind the book is very similar to that.
To some extent, yeah.
So don't blame only Russians.
No, of course
Many
not.
people want old, good Europe.
I think that's definitely can be seen everywhere. I don't see any more questions in the chat. I'm going to post your a link to buy your book. So hopefully that's going through there now to the chat. So if anybody in the comments wants to be able to buy the book, there's a link there now. And from many of the people in the chat, it seems like it's a great book, and I'm looking forward to checking it out myself.
Thank you.
We don't have any more questions to ask, and I think probably it's about time to wrap it up anyway. So I'd like to say thank you both so much for your talk and for answering the questions. It's been one of the most enlightening discussions that we've had at Pushkin House over the last time that we've been doing these online events. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining in.
Yes, and thank you for everybody who's supported Pushkin House by donating and viewing this event, and for all of the people who posed questions as well. Thank you. They were all brilliant. And yes, we'll see you hopefully at the next event. We've got an event on Friday, which is about something completely different. It's about Penguin Russian classics. So any of you who love to read Russian literature in translation may want to check that out. Otherwise, thank you all, and see you then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.